Dealing with storage and RAID issues is very important because this is where our data lives. So let's talk about how to apply the troubleshooting methodology to solving these types of problems. So with storage, the first perception with many people is that the storage will last forever. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the storage media does not last forever. It's critical that we back up data periodically. Now, periodically for some people or organizations could mean daily, or it could mean a few times a week or weekly. Unfortunately, in some cases, it could be longer than that. We don't want to do it. You always have to take a look at what the maximum tolerable amount of data loss is. And if that is 6 hours, then you need to make sure you're performing a data backup at least once every 6 hours. The other consideration is that hard disk drives, or HDDs, these have mechanical components, motors that drive spinning platters. And so because of that, there's more that can go wrong. Hard disk drives will more than likely fail before solid state drives that do not have any moving components. The other consideration is that the storage issues that we might run into, the symptoms that we encounter, could be related to software or hardware. Now, what does that mean? Well, it could mean that we've got a software issue in the sense that the file system has become corrupt, but the underlying storage hardware is running just fine. In other cases, we might have a problem with the RAID controller. So we might have a problem with the card, or maybe the firmware needs to be updated. So always think software versus hardware, which is the most likely culprit when it comes to storage issues. So some common storage-related symptoms begin with a failure to read or write to the disk. The obvious needs to be discounted first. Is it simply a permissions issue, whether we're doing this locally or across the network? Or, if we take a look at a log on a machine, are we getting error messages about the disk perhaps not being able to read or write to or from certain sectors? If you hear a clicking noise with a hard disk drive, that means imminent failure. Not a good thing. So when you hear a clicking noise, you want to make sure that you grab as much data as you possibly can from that drive or drives before they actually fail. Another symptom is slower than usual disk performance. You need to have a baseline as to what's normal before you can determine what's abnormal, what's slower than usual. Now, sometimes this could be as simple as the disk is almost full, and so the operating system doesn't have as much free space to work with. Other times, it could be indicative of a failure or an imminent failure of the hardware. Then we have problems we might run into related to the disk drive not being recognized. Often, this will be an issue that we see upon startup, especially if we've installed a new drive. But it could also be a problem while a machine is running, such as a server that uses a RAID disk array if we have a disk failure. If you have an operating system not found message, that could mean that we've got corruption with operating system boot files. Or it could mean that we do have a problem with the disk. Again, could be hardware or software related. If we get messages related to RAID not being found, we have to determine whether the system that's affected is using software RAID or if it's using a hardware RAID controller. Either way, the best thing to do is to make sure, if it's a separate add-on card, that the RAID card is seated snugly in its socket, and then we can run diagnostics against it. In the hard disk drive world, we've got self-monitoring analysis and reporting technology, otherwise called SMART. This is very common. It really boils down to being disk drive firmware. But what does it do? Well, with servers and disk storage arrays, the SMART disk drive firmware is used to predict imminent hard disk drive failure. Now, this means that we need to make sure that we back up our data constantly in case we do have some kind of a failure. Many storage arrays might have little displays where it will tell you if there's an imminent failure and it will beep so you'll know that something is going wrong. So what can we do to solve some of these storage-related issues? Well, the first is perhaps to go into the RAID controller diagnostics if we're using a hardware RAID solution. Now, how do you do that? Well, that's going to vary from one vendor RAID controller to another. Sometimes the RAID is built into the BIOS, so you can go into the BIOS settings on your machine to configure it or to run diagnostics. Other times, if it's a separate add-on card, you're going to have to press a certain keystroke when the machine is starting up. Maybe, for example, pressing Control-G as the machine is booting up if you want to enter the Intel RAID BIOS, for example. Of course, there's always replacing failed disks. If we think about our disk clicking noise, if we've backed data up from it, we need to replace that disk and not rely on it any longer. Then we might even test network storage. When it comes to network storage that might appear local to the machine but actually resides over the network, we have to think about network connectivity as potentially being a problem, or network congestion, or even permissions to the shared network storage over the network. You can also run operating system disk volume diagnostics. Now, for example, on a Windows server, you could right-click on the disk drive and go into the properties and look at the disk tools to make sure that you check the disk for any potential errors. Of course, there are third-party tools that will do that more thoroughly. We should always ensure that cables are fully plugged in, both data cables for storage media, as well as power cables, for example, for internal SATA hard disk drives. Pictured on the screen, we see an example of a software-based disk scanning tool. This is SpinRite. Now, SpinRite is a tool from Gibson Research Corporation, and there are many others that do the same type of thing. The idea is that when we have a problem with the disk and we can no longer read data, what we can do is boot through alternative means, so don't boot into the operating system, but boot through a specialized boot disk, and then run these diagnostics. Now, pictured here, we can see that unrecovered data is listed within red squares, whereas recovered data is listed within green squares. So oftentimes we can actually get data back even though the disk perhaps is in the midst of failing. Next, what we see here is how to identify failed RAID disks when we have a RAID storage array. Notice here we have a number of handles that are used to pull disk drives out of the slots. And often there will be indicator lights for the drives as well as for the device itself if there is some kind of a problem, such as a failed disk within the disk array.